welcome to KHQ's Sunday Journal. I'm Bob Briley. Every now and then we have an opportunity to have a guest in the studio with us who is a person with an enormous responsibility to bear, such as the case today when we have with us the captain, the commanding officer of one of the largest naval vessels in the world, the USS Iowa, Captain Jerry Gneckow. Captain Gneckow, fortunately, is on his way to the University of Idaho, where he is to be inducted into the Hall of Fame. And I guess the reason being that you are the captain of the Iowa.
Correct.
How did that come about?
You mean, why am I the commanding officer of the Iowa?
Well, we'll get into that later, but how come you're going to be inducted into the Idaho Hall of Fame?
Well, Idaho alumni have had a long tradition of recognizing people who were very successful in their own individual field of endeavor. And I think because I have been successful in the Navy is the reason that I'm being inducted into the Hall of Fame.
I guess we'll talk about the Iowa here in a little bit, and we'll show you some videotape of this great battleship and talk about her a little bit in detail. But it seems that over the years, at least in past history, that most of the commanding officers, the flag officers, as you refer to them, were out of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, and here you are, a graduate of the University of Idaho, where you attained the rank of ensign through the Naval ROTC, was it?
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that is true. For a long period of time, most of our flag officers did come from the Naval Academy, and I think that's primarily because so many of the officers who stayed in the Navy for a career did have their beginnings at the Naval Academy. But over the years, that has changed significantly, and as a matter of fact, the last couple of years, more flag officers have been selected who come from a college background than from the Naval Academy.
Mm-hmm. From being the commander of the Iowa, what would logically be the next step for you? A task force commander or something of that nature?
Probably not. I've been selected for the rank of Commodore, and I'm sure that my next assignment will probably be someplace in Washington, and most likely in a joint tour. In other words, a job that encompasses several services in cooperation.
Mm-hmm. The rank of Commodore has been reinstated. We used to hear that years ago. Our great naval heroes were Commodores in some cases. In recent years, the Commodore has kind of been a yacht club term, hasn't it?
That's true. Although we have used the honorary term Commodore to denote a captain who was in charge of a number of ships. Mm-hmm. And it's only been in about the last 3 or 4 years that the traditional rank of Commodore has been reinstated, and it's the equivalent of a brigadier general.
Mm-hmm. Before you came to the Iowa, you were the commanding officer of a cruiser?
That's correct, the Richmond K. Turner.
Where had you served with the Turner? Any of the places that we refer to as hotspots around the world?
Yes, the Richmond K. Turner was a cruiser homeported in Charleston, South Carolina. Mm-hmm. As such, she was a member of the Atlantic Fleet and made routine deployments to the Mediterranean, the Baltic, the North Atlantic. Mm-hmm. In those areas, of course, we were eyeball to eyeball, so to speak, with the Soviet Navy and other navies of the world, and had an opportunity, I think, to have a big impact on world events.
When you say eyeball to eyeball, shouting across the waters at one another, that close?
Well, of course, we don't do much of that, but
don't use the old bullhorn.
No, but we very frequently operate in close proximity to one another, and it's not unusual at all for the Soviets to follow us, to keep track of our movements by having one or more ships in very close proximity to an aircraft carrier or to one of our other high-value ships.
When you say close proximity, how many miles are you talking about?
In some cases, within a mile.
Isn't that a little dangerous?
It can be.
Collisions can occur. We've had a collision, I think, in the past couple of years.
Yes, we have.
A submarine and another.
Luckily, fortunately, I guess, the U.S. And the Soviets have entered into an agreement with respect to how our navies will operate, one in close proximity to one another. And there are specific signals, specific agreements about what we will and will not do when we're close to one another to avoid accidents.
For example?
We will fly certain flags when we're going to maneuver in a certain fashion. Of course, there are rules of the road that we're required to comply with anyway, with respect to what kind of whistle signals or who has the right-of-way under given circumstances. But we have gone even beyond those rules to make very clear to every commanding officer of a ship at sea what his responsibilities are when he is in a position where international confrontation could be caused by an accident.
Have you ever had the opportunity to meet your counterpart on a Soviet vessel?
Yes, I have.
Or visit a Soviet vessel?
I have visited a Soviet vessel. As a matter of fact, it's been over 10 years ago, and it's not a normal practice for a U.S. officer to get to visit a Soviet ship, nor for them to visit us. But this was a unique circumstance in which a U.S. ship that I was on and a Soviet ship were both in the same port in Ethiopia at the time that Haile Selassie was still the king. And we did have some interchange, and I was able to visit the ship.
What was your impression of the Soviet vessel that you visited?
Well, my impression of the ship was that it was a very capable ship, had very capable weapons and electronics equipment on board, at least from outward appearance, that the people were well disciplined, understood why they were there, but that the actual craftsmanship that went into the building of the ship was probably not as good as in the U.S.
That's interesting. Of course, maybe they don't feel that you need all that craftsmanship showing. If the guts of the ship perform well, that's all you need.
Well, we're convinced that the Soviet Navy has a very, very capable Navy with good, reliable weapons.
We'll talk about that a little bit later on, but I think we should take a look at some of the videotape that you brought along of the Big Stick, the USS Iowa, which was mothballs for quite a long time and has been recommissioned a year ago, has been back in active service for a year now?
That's correct, since April of 1984.
How has the Iowa changed since she was put into mothballs? What's different and new about her?
Well, she has been completely modernized. Many of the World War II vintage weapons systems have been replaced with the very latest in surface-to-surface missiles, Tomahawk to be specific, and also we have added the newest technology in radar, communications, and other electronic devices. So the ship is in fact a modernized battleship with great offensive and defensive capability.
Let's talk a little bit about her statistics. How big is the Iowa? I recall when I was a young fellow that battleships traditionally could not exceed, I think it was 33,000 tons or something like that. That was back before World War II.
Right. The Iowa is a 58,000-ton ship, 887 feet long, about 3 football fields worth. She's 108 feet at the beam, which is just narrow enough to get through the Panama Canal, which is 110 feet in width. And we have, in fact, made 2 transits through the Panama Canal in the past year. The ship has a 38-foot draft, and she carries 1,500 men.
You would think 38 feet, that seems like a small figure to me for a ship that weighs 58,000 tons.
It does, although most of our ships today in the Navy have a draft of somewhat less than 30 feet. So this is a much deeper draft ship than most in our Navy today.
Under full sail, so to speak, can you tell me how fast she will travel?
Sure. She'll go in excess of 30 knots. We've had her up to 31 or so several times without any problem. We don't normally travel that fast, though, because it takes too much fuel. Are
they diesel powered? What is the power plant run on?
This is the same power plant that it had back in the 1940s. It's 8 boilers and steam turbine driven shafts.
People have never been down in the bowels of a ship have no idea of how enormous that machinery is. It's astounding.
That's correct.
The shaft that turns the propellers, they're many feet in diameter, are they not?
Well, the shafts on the Iowa are probably about this big around. And they're very long, of course. Each one varied in length because it emanates from a different engine.
As the captain of the ship, are you expected to know almost every detail about the Iowa?
Well, I know a lot about the Iowa because I've been there since the first day of the reactivation, and I, of course, have seen the ship built brick by brick, so to speak. And so I probably know more about the ship than many commanding officers know about the ships that they are in command of. But I have, of course, a number of very professional assistants to help me. There's no way a commanding officer can know everything about his ship. It's impossible. They're just too complex. So we have many very well-trained and proficient officers to help.
That's where the delegation of authority becomes important. Choose the best men you can find. Do you have a selection or a choice, a hand in the selection of your officers?
No, I don't. And it's really more beneficial for someone else to make the selection, because the Bureau of Naval Personnel, or an organization that knows the background and the experience of all of our officers, and is in a much better position to make a choice about who is best qualified to serve than I would be, because I have a limited knowledge of the total number of officers who might be qualified.
What was the history of the Iowa before she went into mothballs? When was she originally commissioned?
She was originally commissioned in 1943. One of her first assignments was the Tirpitz Patrol on the Atlantic coast, as in an attempt to neutralize the German battleship Tirpitz. Shortly thereafter, she picked up Franklin Delano Roosevelt from the continental United States and took him on the first leg of his trip to the Turan Conference. Dropped him off in Casablanca. That was a very historic occasion. He occupied the commanding officer's in-port cabin on the Iowa. There was a special bathtub installed for his use because he was a semi-invalid, and that bathtub is still there, used by the present commanding officer.
Pretty elaborate.
Yes.
Other people of note who have traveled on the Iowa?
Of course, during the same trip that Roosevelt made the trip to Casablanca, there was the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff and all of Roosevelt's aides.
The mission of the Iowa, I guess, back during World War II, as you said, was partly to neutralize the Tirpitz, if possible. What else were battleships' main missions concerned with? Was it to stand offshore long distances out and throw those big 16-inch shells, or 18, or whatever they were, onto enemy fortifications to try to put them out of business?
Well, the original intent when we designed the Iowa-class battleship was to fight other battleships or other ships at sea, and to be able to withstand a great deal of punishment. The ship is very heavily armored. It was built to take a hit from a 16-inch projectile, which is about the equivalent of a 2,000-pound bomb. But as it turned out, those ships never really saw the kind of action that we designed them for. They were instead used largely in a shore bombardment role, which the 16-inch gun is a very good weapon to use. For example, as I said, the 16-inch projectile is a huge projectile. The high explosive version, 1,900 pounds. The armor-piercing version, 2,700 pounds. It'll penetrate 30 feet of reinforced concrete. It'll dig a hole 30 feet deep and 50 feet across. So it's a very good weapon to use to support an amphibious assault or shore bombardment.
What about its vulnerability to submarines?
This ship is the most survivable ship afloat today in any Navy, including ours. It's very heavily armored. The entire propulsion plant and all the vital spaces of the ship are surrounded by a minimum of 12 inches of armor. In some places, the ship is 17.5 inches thick. This is in contrast to the other ships in our Navy today that have a skin of less than a half inch.
Well, how many ships of the Iowa class are there? Are there any more that have been decommissioned?
There are four of the ships. The New Jersey is of the same class. She is active now. The Iowa, of course, which has been active for about a year. The Missouri, which is presently being reactivated at the Long Beach Naval Shipyard. And, of course, the ex-USS Wisconsin, which is still in mothballs.
Of course, there's always argument over whether or not this is a feasible thing to do, but I guess in your opinion it is feasible to take these ships out of mothball and refit them, re-outfit them, and modernize them, so to speak.
Well, it turned out to be a grand idea in the case of the Iowa-class battleship, because those ships were really not steamed very hard or very far. The engineering plants on those ships are less than 12 years old in terms of steaming miles and steaming years. Most of the other ships many of the other ships in our fleet today are in excess of 20 years old, some as many as 40 years old of continuous service. So by that criteria, the Iowa-class battleship is very young. And as it turned out, it's also a tremendous economic asset to us. It was a real bargain for the taxpayers because we were able to reactivate it so cheaply. The total cost was $400 million, which is a lot of money, no argument about that. But that's what it costs the Navy to buy one frigate today. So with the same investment, $400 million, we were able to get here a ship that is much more survivable, has about 20 times the firepower of a frigate or a destroyer. So this is a real bargain for the taxpayers.
Has the type or classifications of ships changed a great deal as the electronic age has come about in the age of missiles? You have the Iowa-class battleship, you have the huge carriers that are in the atomic submarines. What about the ships on down from there, the cruisers and the destroyers and the frigates, and is there new kind of naval vessels in operation?
We have a great number of new kinds of ships that are a product of technology of this age. For example, things like air-cushioned vehicles, huge submarines, surface ships that run on gas turbine engines now instead of steam. So we have taken advantage of all that technology, and much of the new technology that we have available to us has been added to the battleship to make it a very current vessel.
I suppose then too the men who man these ships, their duties may have been altered somewhat. I suppose basically the duties are relatively the same, but a lot has changed there, and the responsibilities people have been given, have they not?
Many of those duties have in fact changed, you're right. For example, I said that some of our ships are now gas turbine powered. They actually use jet engines of the type that you would expect to find in an aircraft to power some of these ships. And so we now have in our surface Navy men who maintain jet engines that you would expect to find in the air portion of our service.
Back in World War II, the term task force was coined by somebody, and we had some very famous small fleets out there. I guess they called them task forces that were headed by people like Bull Halsey, for example, a man of enormous talent and courage. They probably had an aircraft carrier or two or three, and maybe some battle wagons along with them, and some cruisers and destroyers. Do we still function in essentially the same manner? Do we still have task forces out there that have certain duties prescribed?
We do. We have several kinds of task forces. We've changed the names somewhat, and the composition of the task force has changed, but a good example of the type of group that you're talking about is what we now refer to as the carrier battle group, which would probably consist of at least one aircraft carrier, several cruisers and destroyers, maybe even a submarine in support. They might also have supporting them land-based anti-submarine warfare aircraft and so forth. So I guess in technical terms the concept remains essentially the same, but the number of ships and the way they operate has changed to take advantage of the latest technology.
The speed and the ability of aircraft to fly very long distances in a short period of time, that has had an impact on naval strategy, hasn't it?
Certainly has. It's given us a capability, of course, to fly aircraft from the aircraft carrier at long ranges, giving us tremendously more offensive capability and punch. But at the same time, it's provided a new threat to us in that the carrier battle group can be threatened by long-range aircraft even from the Soviet Union at great distances from its operational area. It also compounds our problem in that these aircraft are now so fast. The reaction time from detection until weapons are released is very short, and really requires us to take advantage of computer-aided weapon systems now in order to minimize the time that the man and the human brain are involved in the problem.
How politically involved is the captain of a battleship? Back in the World War II days, for example, you would go into action and perhaps be kind of isolated from the rest of the world for a while you fought that engagement. Today, with communications the way they are you constantly in communications with, say, for the chief of staff of the entire naval department?
We can be. The communications certainly exist to allow very centralized control of a battle group, and I think from a logical point of view, in the world that we live in today, we want to have our leaders have a say in exactly what is happening in a period of confrontation. But if hostilities were to occur, it is very likely that the communications that you're talking about would disappear, and then we would be back to the commanding officer or the officer in technical command of a battle group using his own wits, his own knowledge to take care of the problem, whatever it might be.
Where is the Iowa right now?
She is in dry dock in Portsmouth, Virginia, undergoing a short tune-up before she starts her next operational period.
What does a short tune-up mean? Not changing plugs and points.
We have just finished the first year of our recommissioned life, and it's normal for a ship, once it's built or reactivated, to go on what is called a shakedown of some sort. It's a test drive, you might say, and at the end of that shakedown period, it will come in, and whatever has been found to be wrong with the ship will be repaired at that time before it's finally accepted by the government from the contractor.
Being the captain of kind of a small floating city almost, I ask a question. It may sound rather broad, but what's it like to be the captain? You stand up there on the bridge and watch somebody else who has, what's the term, has the con, and you tell somebody to plot a course, and you're responsible for where that ship goes, that it gets there safely. You have 1,600 men, enlisted men on board the ship whose lives you are responsible for. The responsibility must be awesome to step up there and say, "This is my ship. It's my baby."
Well, it can be. It is awesome, and it can be as bad as you make it.
Well, I'm not trying to make it bad. But
if you choose to try to solve every single problem yourself, you will not be successful. You must delegate authority. You must have confidence in the men that work for you. You must tell them, give them general guidance on how you want things done, and then expect them to carry through without a great deal of specific guidance or interference in what they are responsible for. And we're very lucky on the Iowa, and I think in the United States Navy in general, in that it's not all that hard to be a commanding officer if the men who work for you believe in what they're doing, if they're motivated, if they think that service to their country is important, if they get some satisfaction from what they're doing, they'll work hard and actually endure all sorts of inconveniences to serve their country. They're glad to do that.
There's a lot of pride in being able to say that I'm off the Iowa.
Absolutely.
Right down to the lowest seaman first class. So,
there is a great deal of pride in being a crew member on the battleship because it's a unique ship that has a great deal of capability. But sailors on the Iowa are also particularly proud of the ship because they have so much time and effort invested in its reactivation. Iowa was reactivated on an accelerated schedule, and we actually finished about 8.5 months ahead of schedule. And the reason for that acceleration was because the New Jersey was in Lebanon at the time, and it was thought that Iowa was the only chance for New Jersey to be relieved. And so we were in the midst of an accelerated program. And our sailors actually worked about 100 to 110 hours a week for almost 4 months, steady, 7 days a week, to get that ship ready to commission and go relieve the New Jersey.
So they really know that ship from stem to stern, do they know?
They do. And they're
from bow to stern.
And they're proud of the effort that they made and their individual contribution.
Can you say where the Iowa will go after she leaves Virginia?
Yes, I'll try to. Although it's difficult because this kind of a ship is so unique. It has so much offensive capability and defensive capability. It's so survivable. It's very likely that we'll be sent to whatever hotspot exists in the world. And I think that's probably the way the battleship will be used. It won't be deployed in a routine fashion. It'll be used as a vehicle of response. But our plan right now is to operate as a member of the Atlantic Fleet in several exercises in the North Atlantic, and then possibly to deploy to the Med or to the Baltic or to some other area like that.
Go down and join the Soviets on patrol.
We'd like for them to have an opportunity to see us up close. Many of the Soviet sailors have never seen a battleship before. In our operations in the Caribbean, of course, the Soviet ships that were present there came over to take a look at us, but I'm sure that they'd like to see us in the Baltic.
What happens, this may be a question, a kind of a broad question too, to cause a collision at sea? We've had a couple of instances in the past years, just recently with the Coral Sea, for example. How do those things happen where a ship like a tanker will suddenly get in the way and boom, you got some damage?
Well,
we got about a minute to get.
It's really hard for most people to understand how this can happen because it seems that the surface of the ocean is such a big place and there's so few ships that you really couldn't have a collision. But in fact, most of the ships are confined to certain ship lanes. They're all headed for specific ports, and there are places where you all come together. Now, there are rules then that you are supposed to follow to make sure that collisions do not exist. But people make mistakes. Sometimes at night, for instance, a ship looks as though it's going one direction when it might be going another. And there's room for error.
Right. Captain, thank you so much for coming by the studio and talking with us. Our guest has been Captain Jerry Gneckow, the commanding officer of the battleship USS Iowa. Captain Gneckow on his way to the University of Idaho, where he will be inducted into their Hall of Fame. Thanks again for being our guest.
Thank you.
I'm Bob Briley. Sunday Journal is a public affairs presentation of KHQ.